Well, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Bradley Yukin. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for the Wisconsin Farm Bureau. It's good to see everybody both in person and online joining us, and I think we're going to have some great information presented today. So I'm actually just going to be brief and turn it over to our two speakers. Chuck and Leonard are going to kind of take it from there. Throughout the program, there'll be opportunities to ask questions, again, either in person or type it into the chat, and we'll get those addressed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our two featured speakers. But again, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brad. Appreciate that. So good afternoon, everyone here in the room and also online. I'm Chuck Nicholson. I work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My work is supported by the Dairy Innovation Hub, the initiative of the state legislature to reinvest in the 3 agriculture universities with a focus on dairy. I want to make sure, I don't know, Tyler, if we got a sound check, can people hear us the way they're supposed to hear us?
Yep.
Okay, if you got that going on there, okay. And I don't know if Leonard, you want to come up and introduce yourself and then also get folks started with the phone poll?
Yeah, so Leonard Paulzine, my formal title is Dairy Markets and Policy Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension. So what I'm going to go to next here is a QR code to just gather a few beginning questions and audience information here. So if you have a cell phone, please feel free to take it out here, and we'll wait a moment as folks are able to do that. As you do go through it, there's, like I say, just a few short questions. One of them you'll be asked to rank things. Just go ahead and select all of them, and they'll kind of populate into the box, and you can then drag them accordingly to rank them. So we'll give you a few minutes to do that.
Did you try to make sure that it's the right one? Okay. Actually had the title up there and then didn't use it for much of it. So maybe I'll try to work on that a little bit. Okay. So I hope folks have had the opportunity to complete these pre-workshop questions. Tells us a little bit about who you are and what issues you find most important. What I'd like to do now is kind of move on to what's our agenda for this afternoon. So those of you who are here may know that this is the third of 4 meetings that will be held throughout the state addressing the issue of the recommended decision that USDA made about potential changes to milk pricing. And in the first 2 of those, which I'll summarize briefly in a moment, we talked about 2 components of the decision that relate to the make allowances that are part of pricing milk, and also to what we call Class 1 differentials, which affect, as the name suggests, Class 1 milk or milk that gets used for making beverage products. So today, we actually want to make sure that we're all a little bit on the same page by having a little bit of background on what is this thing we call federal milk marketing orders, what are they designed to do, a little bit about their history, provide an overview of the broad sets of changes that have been proposed as a part of what USDA recommended back on the 1st of July. We'll talk a little bit about why is USDA doing this? What is the motivation for thinking about changes to milk pricing at this time? And then we'll talk a little bit about the implications of those changes. I mentioned earlier this thing we call the make allowances and class 1 differentials. I'll give you a brief summary of that. And then we'll get into other aspects of the decision, which are a little bit like a mixed bag of a bunch of different things, but we'll kind of talk through them one by one. And the implications here that we're focusing on primarily are really the implications for farm milk prices, because those are one of the key impacts that these recommended changes are likely to have going forward. We'll have time for some Q&A, both from folks here in the room and then also for questions that are submitted online. And then importantly, we're going to talk about the next steps in the process that we go on from here, which include importantly what is called the producer referendum, or the producer vote on whether or not to accept these proposed changes. So we'll cover all this stuff. It is important for us to keep an open agenda to kind of hear what is on people's minds about the different issues. So we'll definitely pay attention to that Q&A component. So it's not just you listening to us, but us also understanding what you would like to know more about. So I'm going to turn it back over to Leonard to run the first part of it then.
So thank you very much. We're just going to kind of establish a baseline a little bit that kind of talks about the framework in which all of these rules, recommendations, everything like that is operating in. So federal milk marketing orders came about through the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act of 1937. So that's the piece of legislation in which sets the framework and guidelines for everything that we're talking about here today. So when the USDA had their hearing, initially, kind of what started it is, well, not what started it, but part of that initial process is gathering information and input from stakeholders, right? Well, if what folks were bringing to the USDA was outside of the say walls or guide rails that this legislation allowed for, they were not able to be considered through this hearing process, right? So sometimes we'll get questions on, well, why wasn't this considered, or why isn't that change considered? Many times it's because this is the original piece of legislation that dictates what we're able to look at and what we're able to adjust, right? So that original act, the Act of 1937, is what allowed us to have these federal milk marketing orders. So, and the aim of that act and the aim of federal orders is to promote orderly marketing conditions in fluid milk markets. So as we go through the conversation today, kind of good to keep that in mind. Originally here, it's to promote that orderly marketing conditions in the fluid markets. Also to improve the income situation of dairy farmers, supervise the terms of trade in milk markets to achieve more equality of bargaining power between producers and processors, and to ensure consumers an adequate supplies of quality milk at reasonable prices. We're going to take just a second to talk about some of the activities or how some of these objectives are facilitated. Some of these you probably heard of before, some of you may not, but they're no less important. Some of the federal orders, they'll provide the order statistics, right? They'll have classified pricing and pooling, collect dairy commodity prices, determine handler prices based on end products, establish minimum uniform prices across the pool. They'll perform weights and measures, component and volume audits. They also ensure timely payments for producers and collect a wide array of market information. Other functions that they do are export certification services. They have dairy standards and product grading, administer the fluid milk processor promotion and the dairy research and promotion programs, the pandemic market volatility assistance program, and the milk donation or milk donation reimbursement programs, etc. So this is a map of our current 11 federal milk marketing orders across the United States. I think it is important to note that not all farm milk is based on federal milk marketing orders. Part of that is that not all farm milk is sold in marketing areas, and milk buyers other than milk buyers other than Class 1 in a regulated area can choose not to be regulated. So we'll just kind of run through some of the key elements in the USDA's recommended decision. So the first one of which is a change in standard milk composition. So where protein is going to be 3.3%, which is up from 3.1%. Other solids will be 6%, which is up from 5.9%. Non-fat solids, 9.3%, up from 9%. Kind of as we go through these, and we'll kind of revisit this at the end as well, but each one of these kind of has a different role or impact in what the end price is and impacts are on dairy farmers, right? Some of these will increase price, some will kind of have a downward pressure on price. So as we go through this list, it's kind of fun to think about that on how all of these interactions play together, which is a big impetus for the work that we're doing here. And I think as part of that original Federal Milk Marketing Order goal, which is to promote orderly marketing conditions, I think this is a good example representation of that. As components in milk continually increase, the standard composition, then, these adjustments with that in order to kind of align the orderly marketing conditions with what we're seeing along with the legislation here. So another element that's recommended is the removal of barrel cheese from that class 3 pricing. And then, of course, the increase of make allowance for cheese, butter, NDM, and dry whey. So these are used in the class 3 and 4 pricing. There is an increase of 5 to 7 cents per pound. And there's an increase in the butterfat retention factor in cheese. So also the recommended decision include the reversion to higher of advanced class 3 or class 4 skim milk price for the class 1 skim milk price. And as we'll get into a little bit today, the provision for to adjust the class 1 price for that ESL milk category. And then increase that class 1 differential. So increase in Wisconsin of about $1.20 per hundredweight and retain the $1.60 per hundredweight minimum differential value. So we'll kind of dive into some of these key elements and what exactly they mean. So.
Okay, thanks, Leonard. Yeah. So Leonard did a nice job of providing you with an overview of all the different possible changes. And I recognize there's a lot of detail and it gets even a little bit more complicated when you start digging into those things. What we're going to try and do is break it down into a little bit more bite-sized pieces so we can assess the kind of implications, as we mentioned, for farm milk prices of these different components of the decision. So we're going to talk about what it means to change the standard composition of milk and what likely impact that will have on farm milk prices. We're going to talk about what it means to remove cheese barrels from the price surveys that we do to determine a class 3 milk price. We have previously talked about the changes in the make allowances, and I'll give you a short summary of what was presented at previous meetings in this series. Leonard also mentioned this revert to the higher of pricing. We'll talk about what that is and what it means. We'll talk a little about the provisions for ESL, which is extended shelf life or longer shelf life milk. And in our meeting on Wednesday, we talked about the increased class 1 differentials, what that means for farm milk prices. I'll give you a short summary of both of those things in a moment. But one of the things we also want to talk about is why are we doing this? Why are we proposing that these changes should be made? So it actually turns out that the make allowances were a primary driver for starting this whole process. And kind of briefly, the make allowances are what we used to connect a product price, like a price for cheese per pound, to what the Federal Milk Marketing Orders say would be an appropriate price for farm milk that gets used in cheese. Okay, so make allowances have not been adjusted since the year 2008. And the argument was made that they do not reflect accurately what it costs to transform farm milk into a product like cheese. This was such an issue, particularly for people who were cheese manufacturers and other dairy processors and their organizations, but also for dairy cooperatives, who also in many situations own processing capacity and make products like cheese. And there was general agreement that the make allowances were not aligned with the actual costs that it took to take that farm milk and make it into a product like cheese. That was actually got us started, but there were some other symptoms that were telling us that there might be an issue with the pricing system that might need to be addressed. So some of those symptoms were depooling, that is milk being taken out of the pool of dollars that are created by federal milk marketing orders. I would also say we can talk about there being less pooling over time. A smaller proportion of the milk is actually part of or participating in those pools. Excuse me. We saw declines in price premiums that were being paid over the minimums that are required by federal milk marketing orders. We saw cooperatives, dairy farmer cooperatives, doing what we call reblending, which is actually taking some of the money out of that minimum class 3 price for cheese that would be paid to cover other of their costs in manufacturing. And in some situations, we saw negative PPDs, or producer price differentials. So I want to give you a little bit of background and show you some graphics that maybe help us explore kind of what these symptoms were that were telling us we needed to kind of make some adjustments, okay? So this is sort of a busy graph that is actually looking at two different things. And then you start down here in about January 2016, and we go through this year. The blue line that you see kind of bouncing around but increasing over time is an indication reported by the U.S. Bureau of the Census of manufacturing costs for cheese. And so the basic pattern there is we saw some increases over time, a little bit of decrease, and then in more recent years, there's kind of been a higher trend in that manufacturing cost. And in particular, kind of early in the 2020s, we hit some price peaks or cost peaks that created pressure to actually say, maybe there's something that is going on with cheese manufacturing costs that we need to address by changing these things we call the make allowance values. At the same time, there's an orange line here, which is our best estimate about what it was that was being paid as an overorder premium to dairy farmers. That overorder means above the minimum price that is set by the federal milk marketing order. And you can see that the trend there is actually towards decreasing premiums being paid. And it actually kind of has a connection to the increasing manufacturing costs. So the things seem to be related. So dairy producers certainly noticed that the premium structure, the premiums that were being paid, had gone down. Dairy manufacturers were emphasizing that part of the reason for that was they were facing much higher manufacturing costs. Okay? So this is for the federal milk marketing order in the map that Leonard showed you, Federal Order 30 here in Wisconsin and parts of Minnesota. But there was a similar trend that actually took place in other parts of the country. These are data collected by the state of New York, their Department of Ag and Markets, where they actually do collect information on producer premiums above those minimum levels. And you can see there's a very similar pattern of decline, even in that part of the country, in the level of premiums that were being paid to dairy producers, okay? So we have some evidence that manufacturing costs are increasing. We have some evidence that premiums are being eroded over time. And we can also look at this rather busy graph, which is actually looking at the proportion of milk from Minnesota and Wisconsin that actually was priced under a federal milk marketing order. So on average, it's about 75%, but there's two things that are kind of important to point out with this. First, there's a bunch of bouncing around. The line goes up and down. The places where the line goes down is really where we're thinking about this issue of depooling. Less milk is being priced based on the minimum prices that are part of the federal milk marketing order system. And we saw some very considerable declines in different years. I left out actually the COVID period, which was even more crazy than that. And then we have times where it bounces back. Okay? So part of it is there's a lot of instability in the amount of milk that is being pooled or priced under federal milk marketing orders, which maybe suggests something is an issue with the way we're pricing that. And the other thing that's an important trend is we've been growing milk in Wisconsin and Minnesota over the years pretty steadily, but a decreasing proportion of that milk is being priced based on the minimum prices in federal milk marketing orders, okay? So Both of those things were suggesting that there may be an issue with the pricing that we need to address. Okay, so based on these kinds of observations we can make from the world of pricing and pooling, USDA convened a hearing at the request of both dairy producers organizations and processor organizations to collect evidence to decide what they should do. So that hearing actually took place over a number of months. 22 different proposals were submitted to USDA. All of them were related to milk pricing. As Leonard said, they kind of had to stay within the guardrails of what was allowable to talk about. There was hundreds of hours of testimony, thousands of pages of documents were submitted as evidence. It actually had like an administrative judge that sat there as if it were some kind of trial to make sure that the evidence was sort of fairly submitted and everything. USDA took all that information, reviewed it, and then they released their final decision, or their recommended decision, excuse me, on the 1st of July. So the things that we're going to talk about reflect the changes that were proposed as a part of that recommended decision. Later on, after we've done that, Leonard will come back and talk about where we go from here, which actually gets us to that thing that I was talking about as the final decision. Okay, so we talked in our session in River Falls on Monday about changes to the make allowances. I said that was a driving issue for making these kinds of changes in the first place. And again, as a reminder, the make allowances in our current pricing formulas are the way that we connect a product price, so like a cheese price or a dry whey price, to what a minimum regulated price would be under federal milk marketing orders. So they proposed increasing make allowances. What are the implications of that? Well, the component value and producer paychecks is going to be lower on that basis if the milk is currently pooled. So if it's part of the pool, the component values will be lower. So other things being equal, pay prices for producers will be down. On a class 3 price, the value of components that we've looked at over recent history in 2024 would be down by about 90 cents per hundredweight. So it's not a trivial number that we're talking about there. The impacts on the value of milk that's not currently pooled are a little bit harder for us to assess. We do know that milk that is not pooled gets a significantly lower price on average than milk that is pooled. So that non-pooled milk probably is not going to see that 90-cent reduction. They may in fact see something that looks a little bit more like an increase. So that component of the implications, the component value and producer paychecks, is not so good. On the other hand, we should see some kind of recovery of the PPD values. They should be higher, and that PPD, again, is the value of components above class, or of value of milk above class 3 component values, driven a lot by the utilization of milk in beverages. And finally, more milk should be pooled. So we should draw more milk back into the pool to try and address that issue with the big variation in the amount of milk being pooled and maybe the downward trend that we've seen. Okay. So for me, this is actually a real key one for thinking about what happens to producer pay prices. Probably has the biggest impact here in the state of Wisconsin. Another of the changes that we talked about on Wednesday at UW-Platteville is increasing class 1 differentials. The USDA said those values should be higher in every county in the United States. How much higher? Went from a nickel a hundredweight to about $3 a hundredweight. Okay, so it's helpful to have a reminder that those class 1 differentials are the additional amount paid by buyers of milk when that milk is going to be used in a beverage. Okay, and it's designed to provide an incentive, particularly in milk deficit areas of the United States, to give transportation the amount of money it needs to move that milk to where it needs to go to be made into fluid milk products. Okay, so USDA said we should increase these throughout the United States. They actually do one of these values for every county, 3,108 of them in the United States. The average increase in Wisconsin would be about $1.20 per hundredweight. They did, as Leonard mentioned earlier, retain a minimum value for that of $1.60, which is not kind of anywhere close to where we are, right? So what are the implications of this? Should have an increased value of the overall order pool, the pool of dollars that represents the total value of milk used in an order like Federal Milk Marketing Order 30. We should see increases in this thing we call the blend price, the PPDs that I mentioned earlier, and the all milk price. This will affect folks not just in Wisconsin, but throughout the United States. There'll be larger beneficial impacts in locations in the US where there's a lot more fluid milk processing happening. Here in Wisconsin, about 5 to 6% of our milk in an average month goes into fluid milk, so it's not a large component of what we do. The overall average value for the United States at the proposed increase that USDA had put out in its July decision is more than $500 million. On the plus side, on the maybe a negative side, we're likely to see some higher retail fluid milk prices because buyers for fluid milk have to pay more to get that milk in the door. And we'll also see some kind of decrease in the class 1 utilization or the utilization of milk for beverage purposes, okay? So the make allowances in this were the things that we talked about in great detail on Monday and Wednesday of this week. Excellent videos are available of the information that presented there, so you can tap into the links that you have for those things and see more of the details that we talked about in those other 2 sessions. Okay, so with that in mind, I'd like to take up the other things that we haven't yet talked about that also have some important implications for farm milk prices. These are changing the standard composition for milk, changing the products that we use to figure out what a cheese price is that we're going to use to transform into a class 3 milk price, and using this higher of class 3 or 4 to figure out what that class 1 milk price should be. Kind of a little subset of that is also thinking about how we're going to price extended shelf life milk under that system a little bit differently, okay? So these are the things that we'll focus on today. They're a little bit of a mixed bag of different things, but we'll try and tie them all together to think about what the overall impacts are likely to be. Okay, so let's start with this first one here about the changing the standard milk composition. Okay, so we have these pricing formulas that I said take a product price like cheese and figure out what USDA's program says an appropriate minimum regulated price for farm milk would be. So an example that's fairly simple, if you don't like equations, then maybe close your eyes here for a second or something. But basically, we would say we're going to look at the butterfat in milk. We multiply it by 3.5. We look at a skim milk price that's calculated in some ways. We multiply that by the other part of the milk, basically, the 96.5% of the milk that is not the butterfat at a standard composition. And we have sort of assumed constant amounts of protein, other solids, and resulting non-fat solids. And the current values actually look something like this, okay? So USDA basically said, we're going to play with the composition factors for the milk, and that's going to change the way in which that minimum milk price would be set. In particular, where this has an impact is on class 3 milk, milk used for cheese and dry whey, and class 4 milk, which generally is kind of like everything else, but mostly butter and milk powders. Okay? So as Leonard had mentioned, we're going to take the current composition factors that we use for pricing milk, and we're going to raise them. We're going to take the protein up to 3.3 from 3.1, take the other solids from 5.9 to 6.0, and the non-fat solids will go from 9 to 9.3. And if you're actually doing the math there, both the columns add up to the number at the bottom. So they were trying to be consistent about making these things sort of align with the overall component values. So why would USDA do this? Well, they heard testimony, and it was pretty compelling testimony that showed that the average milk composition has changed over time. We're putting a lot more components into farm milk than we used to. This chart is actually looking at sort of on a national average basis. The green line is actually looking at average butterfat tests, and we're going to use this scale over here that goes from a little below 3 to a little bit above 4. You can see, particularly in recent years, we've had an acceleration in the amount of butterfat that would be average test for milk. But we've also seen increases in the orange line, which is the non-fat solids, the things that are solids in milk other than the butterfat. And it's a little bit harder to see because of the scaling here, but the blue line is actually the protein test. So USDA heard from lots of folks that milk has a different composition than it used to, so you should probably change the way that you're thinking about that standard composition for pricing milk. You can also look at this over a little bit shorter time horizon and kind of account for the fact that there's a great deal of seasonal variation in the components in farm milk. Again, the top line here is actually looking at butterfat. The yellow line there shows there's a lot of seasonal variation, but the trend is always up. Same thing down here on the protein side, the blue line, a lot of variation by season, but the trend is always up. So when USDA looked at this, they said, that's some pretty compelling evidence that the component composition of milk has changed. So we should think about making some adjustments there. So I'm not going to try and make your eyes glaze over too much, but there's actually like a whole series of connected little formulas and calculations that USDA goes through to get to this thing that we call a class 3 price. I'm highlighting here some of the different elements, and any place you see a red is where USDA is proposing to make a change. So there's a bunch of stuff that they're thinking about changing at the same time. But one of the things that we're highlighting here is if you go to that right-hand side of the screen where I've highlighted some things in yellow, that's where that change in the composition is going to make a difference for a class 3 milk price. You're going to say there's more protein in the milk. That should be reflected in the value of the milk that we're paying to farmers under the minimum pricing. There's more other solids in the milk. That should be reflected in the pay price that we're going to make to farmers. This actually happens in a place that's called the class 3 skim milk price. It's focusing on the skim components, not the butterfat components. But if you go down to the last of the little equation things down there, that then directly affects the class 3 milk price, okay? So raising the composition factors adds value because it says there's actually more protein in milk. There is more other solids in milk than there used to be. That should be reflected in the thing that we're reporting as the class 3 milk price. Okay, so by raising those component values, that would have an increasing positive effect on the class 3 price. Okay, so again, I'm not trying to overwhelm your eyes. And if you want to focus on only a couple things in this long equation, that's great. But I've highlighted places where USDA is thinking about making these changes. This class 3 skim milk price. This would be information from September 2024, kind of the most recent that we have available on pricing under federal milk marketing orders. And you can actually see, if you go to the far right column over there, our current system would say that skim milk price in 2024, September would be 11.09. With the adjustments to the components and other factors, it actually ends up being 10.99 per hundredweight. So notice that the yellow places there are lifting that up. The reason it's not overall an increase is because the make allowances have changed those protein prices, other solids prices, and the butterfat price, okay? We can also look at the class 3 price. If we value it and take into account these changes, in addition to the make allowance changes, we get a little bit different perspective on that. Instead of 10 cents down from the current formulas, the class 3 price is 32 cents down. And as I mentioned before, if we look at the value of components in milk, then that is actually a larger negative impact on pricing if we look at the changes overall that are being proposed in the pricing formulas, okay? So these are 3 different ways in which we can think about what's likely to happen to prices that folks might care about. Mostly we pay milk on the basis of components in an order like Federal Order 30 here in the Upper Midwest. So this is kind of more reflective of the fact that the component values themselves will be decreased, right? So I'll kind of remind us that this is for milk that's currently being pooled, being priced under federal milk marketing orders. It doesn't apply for milk that is not currently being pooled, okay? So let's have a little bit more of a perspective on this. I said components have increased in recent years. That was an argument in favor of doing this. Increasing milk composition factors would help align class prices and also help with that issue of depooling of milk. That class 3 milk price is higher as reported. That actually helps to align the prices a little bit better. The arguments that were made against mostly came from fluid milk processors, basically talking about how the changing those composition factors doesn't affect us at all because we don't sell our milk on the basis of how much solids there is in it. So you're just charging us extra money for something that doesn't have value to our customers. And oh, by the way, we're not sure we can cover or recover the increased cost of milk. Okay. So ultimately, USDA heard both these arguments and they decided we're going to go ahead and make these changes. We think it's an appropriate thing to do. We can also look back over a longer period of time, not just September 2024, but we can go back lots of different years. This rather busy graph is actually showing you the green line is the difference in a class 3 milk price with these compositional changes. The orange or yellow line is the difference in the class 4 milk price, kind of a lot less important to us here in the upper Midwest. But if you focus on that green line, what you see is there's a lot of bouncing around there in terms of what difference the composition changes would have made to a class 3 milk price, but they're always positive. They would always have an increasing effect on the class 3 prices, okay? So this basically is trying to tell us a little bit of something about a longer time horizon over which we're looking at potential impacts. Again, the composition factors, other things being equal, would have a positive effect. But I would say we should probably be a little bit careful about thinking about that longer term perspective going back because looking back doesn't help us to account for all the changes that might take place going forward. So I mentioned if we had like a 92-cent increase on the value of class 3 components in farm milk, that starts to be enough for farms to start thinking about making some decisions differently, maybe not pushing cows as hard with feed, maybe culling that extra cow a little bit more. And so that and the fact that we'd have some additional demand for milk from cheese buyers because their cost has gone down is going to change the dynamic going forward. So all the stuff that I showed you may be helpful to think a little bit about the size of potential impacts in the past, but we got to be a little bit careful. It may not represent exactly what takes place in the future. The other thing is the impacts of composition that I just talked about apply to the prices that USDA reports, the class 3 milk price. But when we pay on the basis of components, how much components are in the milk, it's the component values that matter, not the standard composition of milk. So even though I said the class 3 price would go up as a result of this, that actually doesn't affect directly the pay price for milk in a place like Wisconsin because we're paid on the basis of components, not on the basis of a standard composition, okay? So other parts of the country that base their milk prices on butterfat and skim milk, there will be some differences that would affect them. The composition factors would make a difference. But for us here, this is actually maybe a bit less important, okay? So that's kind of what I want to talk about in terms of the composition factors. You can already see there's a lot of details there that get a little bit, hard to get out of the weeds on. And we kind of fully appreciate that, but maybe this is something that if folks are interested, they can go back and look at a little bit and maybe ask some questions about.
Can back you up on that second to the bottom line there, where it says no.
That one. Yep.
It doesn't affect our pay, but it affects the component price in the order. Why did we change it then?
Okay.
I guess it doesn't mean any more money for me or less money for me. What's the point?
Okay. So I'll repeat the question if that's okay, so that folks online can hear that. So the question is, say we're looking at this thing, it says it doesn't affect my pay prices, why are we doing this? And maybe why are we talking about it? If I can paraphrase you that way. So there are parts of the country that price milk a little bit differently than we do in Wisconsin, where this does affect the pay price. Here in Wisconsin, this doesn't affect the pay price. The dominant impact, as I mentioned earlier, is that change to the make allowance. And that change to the make allowance is what is going to reduce the paid values of components in farm milk, right? And that, in a place like Wisconsin, is where we get to that being the dominant effect. Okay? So this is important in some parts of the country, and it does affect, and it's important to understand, the price that USDA reports is going to be higher as a result of this. But that doesn't mean that it actually makes your pay price higher as a result.
So then on the national blend price they use for the DMC program, will that price be higher?
So
Really getting that much more money?
I can show you some additional information in a minute. It's a great question. The question is basically, is that going to affect the national price that's used for DMC? The short answer to that is, on average, we're projecting, and I'll show you some stuff in a minute about this, The all milk price is going to be, after the like 5 years of adjustment to this, is going to be a little bit lower on average than it would have been otherwise. If you look at what USDA has reported, they are reporting positive benefits from the changes across most of the regions of the country, with the exception of here in the upper Midwest, in California, and in Arizona. So there's a little bit of a difference between, again, looking back and what's likely to be the case going forward. So the answer to the question of, is this going to make pay prices under DMC higher? The answer is, especially not early on, but maybe later, as milk supply and demand adjusts. Does that help answer the question for now? Happy to kind of continue the conversation about that. Okay. So let's talk about something else that's related to the decision that just came out in July. This is actually trying to, I mean, it's another one of these busy graphs, but I'm trying to kind of capture here that we start with different commodity prices for cheddar cheese, for butter, for dry whey, and non-fat dry milk. We use those things in the formulas with those things I was calling the make allowance that are kind of the bad boys here to calculate component values that are going to be how farms would be paid for milk, right? But it also depends what the milk is being used for, which class it's in. Again, class 1 is beverage milk products. Class 2 is what we call soft products, ice cream and yogurt. Class 3, cheese and dry whey. And class 4, again, is that catch-all that is mostly butter and milk powders, right? So when we price milk, we start with these surveyed products. We calculate component values. We think about where the milk was being used. We capture the entire value of how the milk was used in a particular milk marketing order. That's the order pool of dollars. And then ultimately that is used to be paid as the minimum pay price to farms, okay? But notice over here, we have 4 different products that we're surveying. USDA does this every month, that provide all the inputs for calculating the component values. Well, the products that we currently use are cheddar cheese, and we have 2 flavors of those, not flavors, but 2 sizes really, 40-pound blocks and 500-pound barrels. We have dry whey of a certain kind, we have butter of a certain kind, and we have non-fat dry milk. USDA surveys the wholesale market prices. What are people paying for these things right now? Those provide the basis for all the rest of those pricing formulas that I showed you to calculate the component values. Leonard mentioned this earlier, but one of the key changes here is we have 2 types of cheese products that we're currently using. USDA is proposing to remove one of those and only use the 40-pound blocks, but not include the pricing for the 500-pound barrels, okay? So this is one of these things where you kind of go, this is getting deep into the weeds. But basically, USDA heard testimony and concluded that these are both cheese, but they kind of operate in different markets and in different ways. And they found that the barrels were sort of destabilizing to the pricing. And so they decided it would make sense to retain only the 40-pound blocks as the price that gets surveyed and that gets used to calculate those component values for class 3 milk, okay? So basically the argument's in favor. There was a price spread, a price difference per pound between these different products, and it had been changing a lot over time. That's kind of the destabilizing part. So they argued that dropping that barrel cheese from the pricing formulas would be something that would stabilize, make the market less volatile, more predictable, more reliable, right? And they also said that the block cheddar cheese price is used to price about 90% of the natural cheese in the US. And this is typically done based off of the CME price, the cash market price for cheese based down in Chicago. And many companies will have a contract that says my price is that CME price plus or minus some number of cents per pound. So 90% of the cheese gets priced based on that, and it's based off the natural cheese on the 40-pound blocks, okay? Well, there were some arguments against that. Basically, barrel cheese is a pretty big product. Sell a lot of that. We're taking away a bunch of the market volume if we don't use that as a part of our pricing formulas. And there was an argument made at least that it most closely reflected kind of like current market supply and demand balance for cheese. So it was a better representation of what cheese was valued at than maybe the 40-pound blocks. Okay. USDA considered these. They ultimately decided to remove that 500-pound barrel from the pricing formulas. And so we can talk a little bit then about what that might mean for prices going forward. So this graph, the green line here, is actually showing the difference in what on the cheese price would have been the cheese price that gets used to price class 3 milk if we had only only blocks versus having both barrels and blocks as a part of the pricing formula. So the overall difference is pretty small. It's about 2 cents per pound. If we only had those 40-pound blocks in there, looking back over about the last 10 years, the overall difference in the cheese price that USDA is going to use to price class 3 milk was about 2 cents. But notice in particular, there's a bunch of bouncing around. Here, it's actually not too bad. It's kind of stable. We get up into the COVID time period and a little bit beyond, things start going haywire. There's lots of big differences. That was part of what USDA was responding to in terms of, it seems to be creating some market instability, stuff that we don't want to see happening with our pricing system. Okay. We can also look at this based on the value that it would have on a key component that's coming from cheese, protein. Again, the blue line is with the barrel protein price. The green line is the protein price if we only considered the market price for those 40-pound blocks of cheddar. And the difference is being shown down here, okay? So on average, there actually isn't that much difference. The protein price would be about 8 cents lower over this time period per pound if we only had, 8 cents higher if we only had the blocks in there. There's a lot of bouncing around. And so USDA said this seems to be kind of an issue with the variation. And so that was part of the motivation to take that one product out of the pricing formulas that we currently use, okay? So the takeaway from this is this suggests that using only the block price will have a positive impact on protein component values going forward based on the historical information that we're looking at here. Okay. So again, I said looking back can be a little bit dangerous. I didn't use my analogy the last time of driving, looking in the rearview mirror, but there's a little bit of that we might think about here. Protein price changes would affect pay prices in order 30. The historical average would be an increase of about 8 cents per protein, 8 cents per pound on protein. Sometimes that would be higher, sometimes it would be lower. Okay. So this part of the change appears to be beneficial. The other part, the change in components, doesn't have a big impact here in the state of Wisconsin. Okay. So one other thing, and this has actually been something that's been discussed quite a lot. We price the milk for class 1, that beverage milk, on the base of class 3 and class 4 milk prices. Okay. And prior to May 2019, we used a way of connecting the class 3 and class 4 prices, had a butterfat price times 3.5, reflecting what a standard composition for USDA was of the butterfat content of milk, plus the other part of that, the 96.5% that's not the butterfat. And it actually used the higher of a couple of 2 different prices on class 4 and class 3 skim milk, okay? So I know there's a lot going on there, but most of what I'm trying to say here is we had a formula that took a butterfat price, some composition factor, a skim milk price, some composition factor, and that was going to give us the value of a class 1 milk. And notice this actually says the higher of. Whichever of those prices is higher, that's what we're going to use to price that class 1 milk. Okay? In the 2018 Farm Bill, Congress decided we're going to change that. Instead of making that the higher of, we're going to make it the average of those two prices. And the historical difference between those two things has been about 74 cents a hundredweight. So that's what we're going to make it. The average of those plus 74 cents. Okay. Well, what actually has happened in recent time period is that average of has been considerably lower than the higher of values would have been. And so historically, it might have been the case that the difference was always about 74 cents, but in recent time period, that difference was bigger. And USDA heard testimony about that, and they recommended a return to exactly what we had before May of 2019, which is use the higher of those two values. Okay. So in principle, the higher of those two values is likely to return a higher value for class 1 milk. And so that could be viewed as kind of a positive perspective on how that affects pay prices. Again, this is really going to be helpful for folks where there's a lot of class 1 beverage milk. It won't be so helpful for us here in Wisconsin. All right. So what were the arguments in favor of doing this? The higher of is going to be addressing some of the issues that we have with instability in the pricing that we have, especially the relationships between class 3, class 4, and class 1. Trying to make sure that class 1 milk has the highest value, because that's, in a sense, the entire goal of the system. And they also argued that the average of had lost a lot of money for dairy farmers from May 2019 through August 2023. Okay, so that average of was getting us less money than the higher of would have given us. The arguments against primarily related to the fact that it would be harder to do risk management if we have the higher of, because it's less predictable than some kind of average. Okay, and folks presented testimony that said it's going to be a lot easier for us to risk manage if we have this average of, and that was actually the basic justification for bringing that back or putting that in place in May of 2019 in the first place. Okay, and they also talked about this idea of extended shelf life milk being an issue for using this kind of pricing. Okay. So somewhat like I've done before, I can show you another graph that tries to help us think a little bit about the implications of this particular decision on the part of USDA. The red line is actually showing what that class 1 skim milk price would have been, hundredweights, dollars per hundredweight. Under the higher of is the red line, the average of plus 74 is the blue line. Again, one of the things you notice is there's a lot of bouncing around. There are plenty of periods of time where the higher of is better. There are other periods of time where the higher of is, or the average of is better. And in particular, one of the things that became a little bit of an issue is this time period here, and this was brought up in the testimony that folks gave to USDA. And they said, you know what? If you look at the overall difference, it's 11 cents a hundredweight. If we take the higher of rather than the average of. But some folks took a little bit of an issue with that because they said nearly all of that 11 cents is coming from right here during the COVID time period. That's when that higher of really would have paid off. The rest of the time, the difference is a lot smaller over a period of time, okay? And in particular, you can see actually here, there's another time period where, and this is kind of more towards current time, the higher of, again, was better. But a lot of that difference is being driven by things that we wouldn't say were kind of normal market conditions. All right. So again, I'll give you the same caution. We can look back as many years as we want, but is that going to tell us exactly what happens going forward? We're not always sure. All right. So the COVID pricing patterns had a big difference on that average benefit of using higher of rather than average of. So probably important for us to think a little bit about that. All right. So the one last thing I want to talk about before I hand it back over to Leonard is one other provision that relates to extended shelf life milk. So USDA got testimony from particularly fluid milk processors that said we would have an issue pricing milk under the higher of if it's extended shelf life milk. This is milk that's defined as having a shelf life of at least 60 days for the purposes that USDA was using. This means that this milk can be marketed and transported differently. It almost becomes sort of like a storable product in a way that we hadn't really thought about fluid milk being before. And the testimony provided at the hearing said, this is an increasingly important part of the product mix in dairy. It's an increasingly important part of how we balance milk supply and demand in a processing plant, and it has a different market timeline. They also said, basically, if we have a return to the higher of, that's going to be a problem for us in terms of pricing this extended shelf life milk, right? So let me show you then what this is being proposed to do in terms of changing the price. This applies to Class 1 milk. This is milk used to make beverages. So the Class 1 price that USDA proposed for ESL milk is the average of the Class 3 and 4 prices. Remember, we said that actually was the thing I just talked about, the higher of versus the average of. So here they go back to the average of, and they make an adjustment to it. Okay. And the adjustment is the average difference between the higher of and the average of, but with some kind of weird and specific timing. It looks a little bit like this. So I've got some months here like this. We're here in October 24, all the way on the right-hand side over there. We go back 1 year, October 23, 2 years, October 2022, back to October 2021. USDA set in place a formula that actually is about as complicated as you can get. It does have some justification, but they said, we're going to take 24 months and look at the difference in that higher of versus average of. Okay. So for milk that would be priced as ESL now, you're going all the way back to October 2021. You look at 24 months, and then you initiate a 12-month lag or a 12-month waiting period. Okay. So they're going to figure out how ESL milk should be priced differently, starting with the average of, making an adjustment. And the adjustment is something that extends out over like a 3-year time horizon, okay? So it actually gets, a little bit convoluted and messy, but we can sort of break it down if we think a little bit less about the timing and what the overall impacts are likely to be, okay? So it affects the timing of the pricing, but the overall impact on the Class 1 is actually really not going to be that important, because the Class 1 price for extended shelf life milk is that average of plus an adjuster. The adjuster is the difference between the higher of and the average of. So over time, basically you get back to the fact that the Class 1 milk is the higher of Class 3 and Class 4, right? So USDA is sort of initiating this smoothing process, pricing process for extended shelf life milk. But we'd expect overall over a longer period of time that we get back to the same price for that ESL milk as we would for conventional milk that's not ESL. Right? So I've given you a lot of stuff to think about. Leonard's going to tell you a little bit about time frame, and then we'll go to Q&A and have opportunity for conversation.
So everything, all the different words and lines we're going to put up here is every step within this entire hearing process that we're using in order to change or adjust these rules for federal milk marketing orders, right? The grayed out ones are the rules or the steps are the steps that we've already went through. So you can see at the bottom of the list here, we have that the USDA issued their recommended decision in July 1st or on July 1st. After that, parties have filed their comments and exceptions in September. So where we're at right now is that we're waiting on the USDA to issue their final decision. So once that final decision is issued, which right now we're looking at around that mid-November mark, that will kind of set the stage for everything that comes next. So, and what comes next is that producer referendum. So the producer referendum is that actual voting process that farmers will get the opportunity to participate in and to cast their vote on what their on this recommended decision. So right now, like I said, final decision coming out sometime in November. producer referendum after that, so sometime early 2025. Once that referendum process, that voting process is complete, USDA will implement the amendments in early portion of 2025. So should we go through this, or we want to take some questions?
So they're gonna hold the producer referendums in early 25. And in early 25, they're gonna implement them?
Correct. So once that final decision comes out in November, right? That will lay out the timeline, the ground rules for what that voting process looks like, right? So right now, since we don't have that, right now, this is just the expectation, the anticipation based on historically what happens in processes like this, right? So that's why when we look at that referendum, since it's in mid-November, right, where this final decision will come out, just on the way timelines line up, right? By the time that votes are cast, counted, right, information is put out, that just puts us into that first part of 2025. And then when we look at how they're going to be implemented, it'll be, again, sometime in 2025.
Yeah, I would say the referendum happens first, and then they implement something. We're using early 2025 for both of those, because nobody's really sure about the time frame.
But is it all gonna be implemented at the same time?
Yes.
Is there still block voting?
We'll get into that. Yep.
Why don't you go through the next part there and then, start that stuff, yeah.
Perfect. So the producer referendum, which again is that voting process here. So dairy farmers will have the opportunity to vote on whether to, so two separate things, adopt the orders with the changes of the final decision or terminate the order, which means that we would have no federal milk marketing order pricing, right? So maintaining the current provisions, so keeping what we have at the moment, that is not an option, right? We're voting for, do we keep federal orders with these proposed changes, or do we not have the federal order system? Or do we not have our order? That's what you're voting on. So, and the voting is by order, not the entire system. So what that kind of brings us to then is that question of, are we better off with the order, with the proposed changes, or are we better off without the federal order? So again, when we're voting, the question is not whether or not we like the proposed changes. We're voting on, are we better off with the order that has these changes or better off without them? So if a vote, or if an order was to be voted out, it would eliminate the beneficial aspects of the order that are not directly related to milk pricing, including auditing, testing, verifications, market information, assurance of timely payment, all of these things, right? So the alternative to that is possible but not on the table, right, is to have a different legislation that would have to go through a legislative process, not the hearing process, that would replace those other functions that would be eliminated through let's say a down vote or to terminate orders. So if the order did go away, the likely result would be that farm milk prices would be closer to approximating that Class 3 price. This is based on the experience of the Western order that was terminated in 2004, and also opportunities to pool milk on other orders would be limited. So another consideration is that it would eliminate payment of the PPD, which averaged 29 cents from January 2022 to date. So questions on that specifically? Otherwise, I think we'll get into some other general broader discussion questions.
Back one slide again, maybe one more, sorry.
We will get into the block voting as well.
You wanna just do that,
Sure.
maybe? That I will.
Oh, sorry, I was going too far. There we go. So When the USDA announces their final decision, which again, November, it will specify the details of the voting process, including the representative month that counts for eligibility, and the timing of the vote. So to kind of get to your question. So date requirements for ballots to be postmarked and received by USDA. Typically, this is 30 to 45 days for that process to happen. And we're getting closer to that block vote here, that question. So eligibility is determined on the producer side, that if you deliver milk to a handler that is regulated by the Federal Milk Marketing Orders geographic area in that representative month. And again, in November, when the final rule comes out, we'll know which month they're using as that representative month. And the producer has to be actively engaged in producing grade A milk at the time that the referendum happens. On the cooperative side, for them to be eligible, they have to represent producers who are actively producing and marketing grade A milk within the order in the stated month. And actively marketing milk means processing or selling in the order. So also they do have to be recognized by USDA. So block voting by cooperatives. So because cooperatives are considered producers under Federal Milk Marketing Orders, they are allowed to block vote on behalf of all their members. So the co-op must provide USDA with certification of the resolution authorizing the vote at the time the ballots are submitted. And if the co-op does not block vote, its members may cast individual ballots. Question on that? Or should we go through? This will answer, I think, some of your other stuff too. All right. So voting threshold, what does it mean for the referendum to pass or for orders to be terminated? To amend the order, first they look at 2/3 of voting producers must approve. So again, the language in that is specific, the voting producers. So if somebody does not cast a vote, right, that does not count. It's of the votes that are cast. That's what's considered, right? So 2/3 of the voting producers must approve. From there, so if that is not the case, then USDA will look at 2/3 of the milk volume represented by milk producers must then approve. So under block voting, cooperatives may cast a unanimous ballot for all their members who are eligible, which contributes towards that 2/3 of voting producers or milk volume. So like we said before, the USDA first counts producers, then milk volume if needed. Additional question?
What percentage of producers are in cooperatives that have block voting?
So the question is, what percent of producers are in cooperatives that have block voting? We were asked this question previously too, so I'll let Chuck kind of walk through some of that.
Okay, so I guess the basic answer is we don't know, because co-ops don't have to tell us what it is that they're intending to do. The information that I've heard kind of behind the scenes is most of the co-ops will likely block vote, and that's about 75% of the milk in the state of Wisconsin, or in the order. So it's probably the large majority of the milk is going to be block voted.
So if USDA picks the month, how far back can they go to pick the month to be representative of the vote?
So the question is how far back USDA can go to choose a representative month.
So I don't think there are any real specific guidelines in the legislation that say how far back you can go. My understanding from talking to people at USDA is they're going to try and make this as inclusive a process as possible and as representative a process as possible. So it's likely to be a more recent month, and maybe like not a month where there might have been a lot of depooling, for example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was my follow-up is, are you seeing a lot of cooperatives staying within the pool recently?
Yeah, actually, there was a graph up there that had all the bouncing around lines kind of thing, but if you actually looked at like the last couple of years, it was a lot more stable. Yeah, so I think that also helps USDA when they're thinking about what month. It's not as big a brain teaser to figure out a month that would be an appropriate one.
So what you're saying then is if we're not in the pool, we're not part of the federal orders. Did I understand that right, or did I misunderstand you?
Okay, let's go back to. Okay. So
I'll slide over here, sorry.
on the producer side, in the months that they determine to be the representative month, you have to be delivering milk to a handler that's regulated by the Federal Milk Marketing Order in that month, and also be actively engaged in producing grade A milk, right? So if,
Processor depools, then are they regulated by the federal milk marketing orders?
so that becomes a little bit of a tricky question because they can be sort of partially regulated, right? But the basic idea is if you're out of the pool in that particular month, you would not be casting a ballot. Or if you're consistently with a handler who is not pooled under the order, that would not meet this qualification. So it's a vote of the people who are in the pool and are being regulated. As I mentioned, about 25% of the milk, if you think about the graph that I showed you, on average is not in the pool in a given month.
And when you talk about the co-ops that are procuring milk.
Yep.
But not processing, is that different?
So if they're engaged in an economic activity such as buying or selling, right? So if they are selling, then they are considered eligible.
Yeah, so if they're representing producers who are actively producing and marketing grade A milk in the order in that month, then that would count for the purposes of the co-op to be representing and block voting that milk.
And then if the co-op is selling milk to a processor, how does that? Does that processor have to be in the pool or not?
So that could vary a little bit. This is where we get into all the intricacies of the legal language in the orders. But if you are, say, a co-op and you're selling milk to a fluid milk bottler, that's going to be milk that's regulated. It has to be. So USDA typically uses this idea of a first handler or first buyer of milk. If a co-op is a marketing cooperative that actually doesn't have its own manufacturing facilities, but it's facilitating the connection between its dairy farmer members and somebody who's buying milk to put it into class 1, that would count for the purposes of eligibility for voting. Those farmers would be eligible to vote either directly through their co-op if the co-op's block voting, or individually if the co-op is not block voting.
Mentioning class 1 milk, is that for all classes of milk?
So, yeah, maybe, like I said, we've been bad about saying what the questions were to the folks who are online. The question is basically, I've been talking about class 1 milk, does that refer to all classes of milk? So one of the things that was mentioned, and maybe we should go back and kind of reiterate it, is federal milk marketing orders mandate that if you are selling a beverage milk product in a particular area, you will be regulated and you will be part of the pool. End of story. You will be regulated. You will pay that minimum price for class 1 milk. If you are not making a beverage milk product, you may, but are not required to be regulated. And so when I talked about the idea of the depooling, that's reflecting I may, but I choose not to when those bars went way down, and I may, and I'm choosing to be regulated under that pool in the times when that bar came way back up, right? So all kinds of milk, all classes of milk can be regulated under federal milk marketing orders, but for class 2, class 3, class 4, the yogurt and ice cream, the cheese and whey, the butter and non-fat dry milk, those manufacturers get to choose in any given month whether or not they would like to be regulated under the pool. The benefit for them of doing that is that they actually get to take money out of the pool. The downside from that is they have to provide all the auditing information and they have to agree to pay the minimum prices. If they're not part of the pool, they don't have to do either of those things. They can pay a price that they think is fair that's not that minimum regulated price. So that's part of the reason that this whole issue of depooling became important, which is people are jumping in and out of the pool all the time. Some months producers are getting paid a pooled price and some months they're not. And so part of the way that they're trying to design these changes is to make for more stability there. So there's greater consistency of pooling. There aren't these incentives to sort of jump in and jump out of the pool. So the basic question gets down to, if you're class 1, you're selling a beverage product in the state of Wisconsin, you're going to be regulated under federal milk marketing orders. If you're in those other classes, you may, but are not required to be regulated. And as I mentioned, about 25% of the milk in Wisconsin and Minnesota is not regulated. Under those prices, yeah, sure.
So the processor determines the amount of milk to pool or depool?
So the question is whether or not the processor determines the amount of milk to pool or depool. And as I said, if you're a beverage milk processor making a class 1 product, you don't get that choice. You are definitely going to be pooled. If you are any other kind of manufacturer of a dairy product, the company that is buying the milk gets to make that decision. And I mean, a lot of the milk, 75% of it does get pooled. A lot of that is co-op milk. So they're making a decision to pool that milk as a dairy cooperative organization.
Why to have it mandatory that they have to pool?
Okay, so the question is whether or not it'd be wise to have mandatory pooling. Everybody has to pool. Turns out that the state of California, before the year 2018, had exactly that system. They had actually similar classes. Everybody had to be pooled. It was mandatory, right? That has never been something that could be done under federal milk marketing orders as opposed to that state marketing order in California. So one of the proposals that was made to USDA was, okay, let's have mandatory pooling for everybody. USDA said, oh, time out. That's not something that we can legally do. We cannot require those other manufacturers of dairy products to be pooled. We can only require the folks who are doing beverage milk to be pooled, going all the way back to that thing that Leonard talked about from like 1937, which is even older than me. Yeah, so is it desirable? There would be a lot of benefits in terms of the stability of the pool of doing that and sharing the proceeds more equally. What it's not right now, at least, is legally doable. Yeah. Yeah, question.
The way I understand it is, the vote would be for either these new regulations which you've talked about, or getting rid of the federal milk marketing order. What would happen to the price of milk if they're got rid of the federal milk marketing order?
Okay. So the question is, the way I understand it, you got the choice between accepting the proposed changes or not having the order at all. What would happen to the price of milk if we didn't have the order at all? Is that the question?
That's the question.
Okay. So that depends a little bit on where you are, but Leonard actually mentioned there was an order that was out in Idaho, Utah, Nevada, that until 2004 was operating like any other federal milk marketing order. And Idaho actually has some similarities other than like mountains and climate stuff with Wisconsin in terms of they make a lot of cheese. They voted out the order. Companies that were buying milk for cheese came up with pricing formulas that were a little bit different than how USDA was classing or pricing components for class 3 milk, but on average ended up looking a lot like class 3 component values. And part of the reason for that is it's a national marketplace for cheese. So all the folks that are making cheese and marketing it are going to end up having some cost structures that look kind of similar to one another. So I had mentioned that the value of the class 3 components under this new system would go down by about 90 cents a hundredweight, right? Well, that might be kind of the thing that we'd expect to have happen if we had no order. We revert to kind of something that looks like those class prices that are being paid elsewhere in the US. And so we'd have that and we wouldn't be paid the PPD, which is averaged about 30 cents. So for the first time in 3 years, it was negative last month. So if you kind of put it in rough terms, 90 cents plus 30 cents, $1.20 without the order.
In the very first slide you had up there, you showed all the things that federal milk marketing orders were supposed to do, and there's 4 or 5 of them up there. I'm not very sure on the number.
Yep.
And I read through each one of them and I said, not done, not done, not done, and not done. None of them are happening today. So the whole point of it is it's not happening. So why are we worried about it? I mean, every time they tweak this federal milk marketing orders, and of course I have gray hair to show I've been around for a while, we never win. There is a huge disconnect today between me and the consumer. Huge. And you know, they want to make allowance. I don't have a problem with that. They need to make money. But my problem is, it should be a percentage, because then there would be an incentive for them to ask more money on the other end, so they would make more and I would get more. Today, there's nobody out there asking for more on the other end. And so there's a huge disconnect, and that's one of the things that when I testified at the hearing, I said, that's what we need. Well, I didn't see that in any of the things except what National Milk wanted was a bigger make allowance, which was a flat number, so they could make more money.
Okay, so I'm going to try and do justice to the question by repeating here, but so there's maybe a couple key points. We started out by talking about what federal marketing orders say they're trying to do. And there are some things in there like promote orderly marketing, enhance returns to producers, equalize the playing field, and ensure that there's a supply of fluid milk that goes to schools and grocery stores. So your comment was, I looked at all those, I said, none of that's happening right now. And I think if I can make the connection, you're sort of saying, and part of that is there's no real connection in the way we do our pricing system that takes that make allowance and makes it kind of work farther on beyond where we're talking about the manufacturer, the processor buying my milk, to think about what happens later on when we're talking about a cheese converter or a grocery store or an institutional restaurant buyer of milk. Did I capture that okay?
You got it. You got it.
Okay. Whew. Okay. So then I think the ultimate question was, you know, why are we doing this? Why do we care about this? Maybe another way to think about that is, why is USDA doing this? Is that a fair enough way to sort of think about that? So we've been asked this question, I think, at every one of the meetings that we've been to so far. And it's particularly relevant because USDA says there are certain regions of the country that are going to benefit from these changes. Turns out those are not Wisconsin. They're not California. They're not Arizona. But there are some other places that we think are going to benefit. And so then you start saying, okay, well, why is that exactly fair? And I would say, well, okay, it's not really fair. It just reflects the way that we are currently structuring our pricing system. Right? So we have a pricing system that says we need to figure out a minimum price that should be the regulated price for farm milk. The way we're going to do that is we're going to start with those product prices. We're going to take away that make allowance, actually make a little bit of adjustment for yield factors, you know, how much the milk is actually yielding in terms of a product. And that's how we're going to figure out component values, and that's how we're going to price milk. So I think the basic challenge is there are going to be some winners and losers as a result of making these changes. I think what Leonard was actually just trying to point out was it's sort of like you can lose this much or you can lose this much more. That's kind of the choice if you're here in Wisconsin, which is not a pleasant choice, but it's still the choice that is available to dairy producers here as a result of the way in which we do the milk pricing. The one last thing that I want to say maybe about USDA is, I kind of made this comment as well in Platteville a couple of days ago, and Leonard sort of said it here, is that USDA got asked to do a lot of things, and they had to kind of weigh evidence and decide what it was that they were trying to do. but they were pretty constrained on the stuff that they could actually allow to be changed. So they kind of took it like, well, a bunch of people presented evidence that cost of manufacturing for cheese are higher than what our make allowance values are. And even National Milk is asking for an increase in the make allowance. So seems like there's some evidence there that we should change that make allowance value. Done. People said, hey, you know what? Those class 1 differentials, haven't changed those things since 2008 either. Cost of moving milk around has changed a lot since then. Diesel, labor, all that stuff is up. People presented some evidence and USDA said, yeah, I think you're right. We probably need to change those things too. And then they, changed these other things that we talked about today. But the way they had to make those decisions was kind of piece by piece. They look at the evidence and go, should we make that change? And you go, yeah, I guess we should. Should we make that change? Yeah, I guess we should. I think they realized that the total package has some pretty significant implications for dairy producers in different parts of the country, but they're kind of constrained by saying, I have to look at this and that, and I've got this guardrail here, and I can change this stuff, and I can't change this other stuff. And so that's what they ended up doing. So I think the one thing that maybe we also talked a little bit about a couple of days ago is this is a USDA process. They control the whole thing. And actually, one of the little things we said was, unless Secretary Vilsack thinks this is a good idea, or whoever the secretary is at the next time that we do some of this stuff, it doesn't have to happen, but it probably will. On the other hand, Congress has been willing to jump in and say, oh, hey, wait a minute. We don't like what you're doing with that. We think you should do something different. So they've actually gone in and changed pricing formulas before. We actually talked about this. They were the ones who agreed that that average of was better than the higher of. They, back in the last time we made a big major reform in 2000, they jumped in and said, no, USDA, you say that, we say this on pricing, right? So this is a step in the process. It might not be the entire end game, depending on what comes out in the final decision, what Vilsack decides to do, and what Congress decides to do in response to the kinds of things that are the implications that we've been talking about today. Yeah, so we're pretty far along in the process, but we're kind of not all the way to the end of the movie yet. Yeah.
So we talked about the proposed, we're talking here today about the proposed rules. Do you have a sense, or did you have a chance to see the people that submitted comments to the proposed rules? And your read on those, as well as, do you see changes coming in their final rulings, perhaps, based upon some of the testimony or comments given?
Okay, so I'll try and do justice to your question for folks online. So it was reiterated that this is a recommended decision, not yet the final decision. So did we look at the comments that came into USDA, the ones that needed to be submitted in September, and do we anticipate additional changes going forward to the final decision? Is that fair enough? Okay. So I have this very talented graduate student who's here with me who slavishly went through all 128 comments that were made to USDA and prepared a summary of kind of issue by issue, who was making a comment, and did they sort of generally approve of it or agree with it, or were they against it, right? And so the majority of comments that were submitted were by dairy farmers or dairy farmer organizations. I don't remember the exact percentage. Do you remember, Jack?
I don't.
Okay, but it was well more than half. I mean, there was a representation across all different parts of industry, but it was primarily dairy producers and their organizations. Major dairy process organizations like IDFA and cheesemakers here in Wisconsin also submitted extensive comments. American Farm Bureau Federation submitted extensive comments. And when you look across the, do I like it or don't I like it? Do I agree with it? I don't agree with it. Despite the fact that this was mostly a dairy producer audience, most of the changes, plus or minus, was pretty evenly split. I like it, I don't like it, right? The one exception to that was make allowances. And for that, it was 8-1 against making those changes. Okay? So that's the flavor of the responses that USDA has gotten, okay? So let's think about this a little bit. So USDA went through this enormously long and painful hearing where they had to sit in a room in the suburbs of Indianapolis, listen to people drone on for stuff for days and days and days. Thousands and thousands of pages of documents. When I was there doing testimony on class 1 differentials, I got handed a 2-inch thick 11 by 17 piece of paper that had like a gazillion numbers on it. And they wanted to try and get me to sort of say, on page 377 of this, what is this value kind of thing? That's the level of detail that USDA was having to deal with, right? So when USDA gets through with all of that, and they've poured through all this stuff and made a decision that is their recommended decision, I think they're kind of feeling like we've heard what you guys had to say. We've looked at all the evidence. We've done our best judgment about what we think ought to be done here. So on that basis, I would guess, and I'm only guessing, that there won't be a lot of earth-shattering changes that come down between the recommended decision and the final decision, right? So one of the other places where there are a number of comments were from fluid milk processors who didn't like the specific value of that new class 1 differential in their county. It was particularly the case for people from West Virginia, okay? So might USDA say, oh, okay, 10 cents different on that class 1 differential value in West Virginia? Okay, that would be a relatively minor sort of change. Maybe they might do something like that. I guess I'm not anticipating that they would make some super duper big changes. The other part of this is, I think USDA wants to be sensitive to and listen to producer opinions about this. But they also know that their job is to base their changes, if they make any, on sort of additional evidence or perspective on evidence. And for the most part, if somebody says, I don't like this, they would say, okay, we understand that. That's not necessarily like super good evidence to say we should change it. And so to the extent that a lot of comments came in as, I'm not in favor of this, but didn't sort of say, and here's why you should think about doing some stuff differently, they've got to have that as some kind of cover to be able to make some substantive changes. So on both those counts, I'm suggesting that we probably won't see super duper changes. I guess we have like 2.5 weeks before we know. Yeah, question.
Come out and they said that some of it still had to be regulated by Congress. And one of them was, I thought, the going back to the higher of, is that really part of this, or is that gotta be separate?
So Congress has the question is, some parts of this can be affected by decisions of Congress. And the question is something like the higher of something that Congress has to act on, or is it something that USDA can act on? USDA has the authority to make that change without Congress. Congress basically said, we have the authority to jump over you if we want to and make that change since you didn't make it. But USDA has the authority to change that back unless Congress comes in again and says, oh, no, you don't. Right? So that particular part of the decision, USDA has the authority to make. One of the other things that was proposed related to make allowances that USDA did not feel it had the authority to do was to mandate a survey of all dairy manufacturing companies to collect their costs of processing like every year and have a process to update make allowances. So that is a place where Congress could come in and say, you know, that's actually a good idea. We're going to require everybody to report their cost information. And we're going to mandate that every year USDA will make whatever appropriate changes need to be made, or every other year, or every 5 years, or something more frequently than 15. Congress could come in and make some kind of change like that that would affect how frequently we update something like the make allowance calculation. Okay, so that'd be an example where they could do something, but they haven't done it yet.
But that's not something they have to do.
Congress does not have to do that, and USDA cannot do that.
Okay.
Okay.
So then it's like pushing the wagon uphill to get Congress to do it, because we know that ain't gonna happen because they're.
So the comment was Congress is dysfunctional or something like that. Yes. Okay. Other questions or things that we can talk about with you? Tyler, we haven't been watching for anything coming in online. Do we have anybody that's been jumping in to say anything? Okay. Well, so given that we have maybe worn out the questions for the moment, let's actually kind of go here. Actually, I'll kind of flip back to this. So again, in the last 3 of these sessions, the one in Monday that focused on make allowances in River Falls, our Wednesday session at UW Platteville that focused on Class 1 differentials, and then the session today that focused on kind of all these other little bits and pieces of this decision. We've talked about them kind of separately, but it's important to remember that the overall impacts are going to take place based on all the changes happening simultaneously. We're trying to break them down into like these different pieces to make it maybe a little bit more explainable about what change is being made and what its implications might be. But all these things would be important. And maybe I'll kind of just jump in a little bit and say, here for Wisconsin, probably not important, this change in the composition of the standard composition of milk, because we get paid on the basis of components. Removing cheese barrels might have a modest positive effect on Class 3 prices here in Wisconsin. Increase in the make allowances is definitely like a big 2 thumbs down in terms of component values, at least in the short term. And I'll talk a little bit more about the longer term in a minute. Higher of is a benefit, particularly to producers in the part of the country where there's a lot of Class 1 milk. Again, with our 5% Class 1 utilization for milk here in Wisconsin, that probably has a very modest positive impact. And the same thing would be said also of those increased Class 1 differentials, a modest positive impact here in Wisconsin, okay? So if we think about kind of the big pluses and minuses, we're really sort of thinking about the big maybe minus being down here with the make allowances and the modest plus being over there on the Class 1 differential side.
When you look at that price increase for make allowance, and you look back 5, 6 years, the amount of premiums we were getting from milk was a whole lot more than that. So do you see us going back to maybe getting some premiums on our milk, or that won't happen until the processor says, hey, I need more milk, and they start fighting for it?
Yeah. So the question is particularly looking at the impacts, negative impacts on component values of the make allowance. One of the reasons that we had this conversation, or one of the symptoms that I mentioned earlier, was we lost a lot of premiums that were being paid. And the question is, are we going to see those premiums come back? And actually, it's a really good question. We have tried to do some forward-looking kind of analyses with our economic tools, and they suggest nationally we're likely to see some return of those premiums, right? So this is actually the 5 to 7 cents per pound on the make allowances, which actually translates into a much larger per hundredweight value change for milk. So we're suggesting that we might see nationwide, recognizing that can vary a lot based on the supply and demand conditions in any one region, premium increases that might go from 5 to 15 cents per hundredweight, which takes us back a little bit in the range that we have been in years before we kind of got to very low premium values. Okay, so I'm going to show you in a minute how I think some of the dynamics of pricing with this are going to play out over the next 5 years. So let me then kind of fast forward to this as a little bit maybe of a summary and reminder. I just showed you kind of, there's a bunch of different moving pieces that USDA shifted around kind of in the shell game that they're playing with the different pricing formulas. So we've tried to look at them in our different sessions so far, kind of like one at a time or a few at a time, even though it's complicated enough to do that. But the impacts are going to depend on all of those changes that are going to happen simultaneously. Another thing that we've tried to emphasize is that the impacts are going to vary a lot by where you are in the United States. So if you are in an order that uses a lot of milk for beverages, you're going to see a higher pay price. if you are in an order that makes a lot of cheese, you're likely to see, at least in the short term, lower component values, lower pay price, okay? So a lot depends on how milk is used in a particular part of the country. And in places like Wisconsin, California, Arizona, a lot of milk is going into cheese. And that is where we're seeing that biggest impact of the make allowances, right? And importantly, as I've been trying to mention, the impacts are going to vary over time. We had a comment here that maybe the premiums will return when the processors decide that they actually are short on milk and need to pay a little bit more to get it in the door. Well, one of the things that's going to be affected as we go forward is both how much demand there is for milk and how much milk is going to be supplied in different parts of the country. Lower the class 3 component values, it gives incentives to cheese makers to make more cheese, buy more components, buy more milk. Lower the component values that are being paid to producers, that gives producers an incentive to make less milk, at least over some time horizon. So demand for milk components going up, supply coming down. The balance is going to push us more in the direction of kind of solidifying maybe some of those premium values or solidifying the price values for milk overall, okay? So to kind of try and illustrate that a little bit, and this will be kind of where we get close to ending up what we're talking about here today. I mentioned we can always look back and sort of say what would happen, but we don't have a really good sense for how producers might have changed their production decisions or how processors were to change their milk purchasing decisions if we change these pricing formulas when the changes that we're talking about are big enough to kind of make both of them take note, right? So we as economists have ways that we can try and model, think about what might happen, project out into the future. And so I'm going to show you here like a couple of different perspectives on this, like for the next 5 years. I'll start out with this, and it's a little bit maybe hard for you to see here, but this is actually showing the projected changes in the different components of the milk price from 2024 to 2028. And it's got different classes here in this one. So the blue bar is a class 1 milk price, and you can see in 2024, we might expect that value to be about 60 cents higher nationwide across all the different class 1 milk pools. 2025, a little bit lower. 2026, 2027, we see some changes. Overall, it comes back to that value that looks a little bit like what we see in 2024, about 60 cents a hundredweight. That's what we'd expect to be the impact on that class 1 milk price. Probably not too important for us to think about class 2, but the gray bar is what we think about as the US all milk price. And what that's telling us across all the different uses of milk and including any premiums that would get paid in 2024, we're likely to see a negative impact on all milk prices from these changes. That's about 10 cents a hundredweight, gets a little bit higher in 2025, starts to recover a little bit in 2026. In 2027, the milk supply and demand balance has become tight enough that that all milk price is actually now higher than it would have been if we didn't make these changes. Okay. So more milk being demanded here, less milk and components being supplied here. Market starts to tighten up over a number of years. That would be kind of our projection of when those milk supplies get a little bit tight and maybe we see those return of premiums and other higher pricing for milk because the milk is a little shorter compared to what the demand is, okay? Overall, sort of a, well, I'd maybe call it modest, but negative impact on the all milk price over this 5-year period of time, a little bit less than a dime during that time period, okay? So varies over time, varies by class. We can do a similar kind of thing here, and this graph is even a little bit busier. The blue bar is like the reported class 3 milk price, the thing that USDA is going to publish that actually includes that change to the composition. The gray bar is actually that value of class 3 components. Okay, you can see there's actually quite a big difference that's being represented there between those two. In a year like 2024, we might expect on average class 3 component values to be down by 60 cents, but that tends to improve a little bit over time as we get out into those later years as milk supply becomes a little bit tighter relative to the milk demands, okay? And if you're noticing a little bit, there are some things that are going on there with class 4 where we actually see some tightening in those markets. Class 4 tends to be the places that we think of sort of as the residual milk supply. We don't do a lot of butter and powder in this part of the world, but places that do that use that kind of as their balancing, their outlet for milk shortages or milk surpluses. And that tends to be the place where we tend to see supply and demand balance being reflected more strongly in those butter and powder markets. And so that's actually showing some higher prices being resulting from higher butter and non-fat prices in those later years. Okay. So with that, we're nearly to the end of what we want to talk about. I just want to make you aware, I'm part of what's called the Program on Dairy Markets and Policy that's based out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we have collaborators also at Cornell University. We have a website called dairymarkets.org. As a part of our educational efforts related to these proposed changes, we have developed a series of really sort of short, like briefing papers. We call them, for reasons that I don't really like, information letters. But we have them on various different topics, some that we've already talked about as a part of this series, but also in particular, the red one there is talking about all the kinds of changes that we talked about today. Okay, so I'll put that up there. My computer's telling me a little bit like, hey, you know what? You forgot to plug me in. So I'm about to die. So let me work on that. Leonard, I'm come up and.
So we'll be around a little bit longer yet for questions, discussions, things like this. But before anybody does leave, if you can just take out your phones one more time and scan that QR code there so we can capture some of your thoughts or additional questions. The one thing I like to do is see if there's anything else that you'd like additional information on, right? So we take these to heart and go back and see how we can answer your questions and needs of those folks here in the industry. So we'll give you a second to do that while Chuck plugs in, and then we'll open it up to questions again.
Okay, sure that did anything.
Can I go back and leave some of this information up? So if folks online or in the room have further questions, want to reach out, feel free to do so.
So any other questions that we can try and address or comments that you want to have be kind of a part of the discussion that we're having here?
Did you go back, I don't know, in the middle of your presentation, there was one graph. It showed, it went from 2020 to 2024. And it's, on the bottom was a line that showed the price of milk. And those two areas, 2020 and 24. And there was no change in the price of milk.
I can see if I can figure out which one. So actually, I think are you talking about the kind of the graphs where I had the things looking forward or looking back? Was I showing, so you said 2024, 2020 to 2024?
I think it is. Try that one. Is it this one or that one?
Well, so I don't know. I don't want to like say, hey, was it this one? But so these are some of the things we talked about. Most of what I've shown is actually changes in,
Yeah, because you said the price at the beginning and on the end was the same.
well, so this is the block versus barrel kind of graph. And so we're looking at here, this green line is actually showing kind of the impact of the cheese price, the thing that goes into that class 3 pricing formula of either doing things with only the blocks or doing it the way we currently do it now, which is the blocks plus those 500-pound barrels. And so what I said was over the long period of time, this black line is the difference if you only had the blocks and not the blocks and the barrels. So it is a little bit higher. It's like 2 cents a pound of cheese higher if we only had the blocks during that time and not the barrels and the blocks. But there's a lot of variation, and there's particularly a lot of variation when stuff went crazy with COVID, but there's a lot of variation after that too. So if we come over here, basically a point like this is saying block only was a lot better than having block and barrel. Basically, what it's telling us is barrel prices must have been low. Down here, this is the point that's telling us barrel plus block would have been better. Argument, barrel prices were strong, block prices were low. Okay, so there's tons of moving around here. If you look across this whole time period going back to 2014, it averages out to be about 2 cents better by dropping the barrels out and keeping both products. But as a producer, you maybe don't care about exactly what that overall average is. What you're worried about is time periods like that, and what you're longing for is time periods like that, right? So USDA, when they said, let's take the barrels out of there, was mostly trying to ratchet down, make smaller these big swings like this. So
So your beginning green line and ending green line is just the spread between the two, not the actual price.
right,
Okay.
it's the spread rather than the price.
I don't think that was the right chart though.
Would it
Well,
a higher of versus average of graph?
Yeah.
Okay.
So as you say, I got a million of them. So, yeah, I know.
Said that, what that chart represents where it's up 15 cents towards the end, that's actually 30 cents spread between the two. Because it moved the average up 15.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a lot of movement, and that's part of what USDA I think was basing its decision on, is we want to stop that kind of crazy movement from happening.
There's one that has 3 lines on it, one on the bottom, and then there's 2 up on the top that's walking down to the west, so there's one on the bottom.
That one?
They went back to 20, they went back to 2000, I think that chart is.
So yeah,
It was a 24-year chart.
now there's that one, which is higher of average of. Let's look here. Well, we can kind of go through all of them pretty quickly. There's that one. That's the composition factors one. Well, I think that's kind of the last of the ones that would kind of be like that. I showed you this one earlier on, but that's not a milk price, that's a premium, and it doesn't have the third line to it. So. Yeah, I think this is kind of one of the main ones. This is also a block versus barrels comparison. And instead of looking at the cheese price, we're thinking about what the implications are for the component value of protein. So, oh, Well, that's interesting. You plug it in and I guess that power grid isn't working there. Okay. So I tell you what, why don't we, I think we're offline now. So we'll take it offline. If you want to look, we can look at it and see what's going on.
Stuck at that. So I don't know, you can continue to present from, or at least talk from this one, if you wanted to answer questions.
Okay, I wonder if actually it'll, if it'll, yeah. Oh, now it's,
Do back up.
it looks like it. Okay, let's see if I can actually get it. I actually wonder if that was maybe not my computer, but their
Oh,
system.
it must be, because you're still on.
I'm still online here, so. I guess they decided here at the Farm Wisconsin Discovery Center, they'd heard enough.
4 o'clock is 4 o'clock.
Yeah,
I think 4 o'clock is closing time.
yeah, that actually may be part of it, because there's like a standard video that when they turn the system on, I think it just runs that video the whole time in here. And so we had to actually override it to make that happen, so it actually could be part of what's going on. Because it was right at 4 o'clock. Okay, well, okay, we can, and maybe when this is posted online, if you have the ability to kind of look through it and you go, that's the one,
Yeah.
you can email me. Okay. Okay,